So we want to answer the question of why exactly did the American industrial center cities, the center city really arose out of the Industrial Revolution, and this sort of explains some of its features. How did this arise? So why did they become so large, and why did they sort of gain the features they did? Because there was, as you read in the Davis reading, there was this dramatic rise of urbanization in from 1850 to about 1940, and we want to sort of figure out why that occurred. And one of the biggest reasons, and Davis talks a lot about this, is that the Industrial Revolution basically made it far more lucrative for a person to move to the city and become a laborer, a unskilled laborer usually, than to stay in the rural areas and be a farmhand essentially. So the wages were low, of course, the conditions were bad in the city, and yet people still chose to come to the city for these opportunities. And we're seeing the same thing happening in China right now. So it's actually quite interesting watching the people from rural China move to what we might think are terrible conditions in the city, and they're doing it in their own free will. So people decided to move to the city because there were these factories which had these means of production that allowed them to gain money, basically, to earn a living that they were not able to earn in the rural areas. So this demand decreased dramatically after 1920, and we saw the especially decrease in unskilled labor. So skilled labor was still required by these factories, but this increased demand for unskilled labor was far less. So that will help explain later why cities might have decreased. So another thing that was quite important for cities was that our food supply got better. So before, it was just very difficult living in such a dense area for you to get reliable and safe food, for the average person to get reliable and safe food. And it was easier in the rural areas. However, the technology, especially refrigeration technology, made it such that we could now, the average person could have access to good food, reasonably good food, even though, by our standards, it would have been terrible. But this food was far better than it had been before. So again, we see another technology changing the sort of calculations people do of what they should do. And now it became, a very reasonable thing to move to a city because you knew you'd have food as well. And along with this, we had a lot of immigration from Europe, especially, to cities. So before this time, a lot of the immigrants were moving to the countryside, setting up farms. But after 1850, a lot of the immigrants stayed in the cities where they arrived in. So before this point, it was very common to head west. Once you'd arrive on the east coast of the U.S. from Europe, you would try to get to the countryside. However, after 1850, you'd arrive in these cities, and there'd be so many opportunities to make wages that you had not dreamed of in Europe. And so this kept people in cities. And so what this did was just increased the population dramatically. Like all these sort of factors combined together to increase the population. And as you saw in the Mumford article, so Mumford is writing about this time period in America where the population is increasing and the means cities have to handle it is not really increasing in sophistication. We just have terrible living conditions by our standards. And it's important to think, yes, by our standards. So apparently it was still worth it coming to the city for these people, but the city was not a nice place. There was no sort of magical urban area that people today often point to that sort of was wonderfully urban and and all and clean and safe. That never existed. So these industrial center cities were not nice places to live, and and yet it was still worth it for people. So we need to think of this, and this will be important later when we're looking at the decline of the city. This is the decline of the rural. So what we witnessed here was a mass movement of people moving from rural areas where they, had extremely low wages to industrial cities where they could get higher wages. And so, it's often claimed that, oh, this was a triumph. The rise of the American city was a triumph. But you also saw the decline of many rural areas. Many rural towns saw their populations decrease dramatically, and these industrial cities benefited. And so, there's always a flip side of population movements, and that was it. People just were moving from these rural areas. We became an urban country, whereas before we were predominantly a rural country. So, and it's also important to remember that, city centers and metro areas were increasing in sizes. So, so around this period, especially later in the period, we saw the first suburbs, so the first railroad suburbs, essentially. And so the entire country was moving into these metropolitan areas. They weren't really metropolitan areas yet. They weren't large enough to be, considered that. Most people were in the city. But, especially in the 1920s, 1930s, you saw the first suburbs. And, in the 1930s, you saw these New Deal suburbs. Like Greenbelt is like this. This was a New Deal suburb. Tacoma Park was also like this. So these sort of first old, close to the city suburbs, which had railroad going to them so people could commute, the wealthy moved out of the city. I know Tacoma Park was considered, a healthy place, whereas Washington, D.C. was, so Tacoma Park is a suburb of Washington, D.C., so Washington, D.C. was considered this, malaria swamp. I mean, it wasn't really that swampy, but people considered it to be unhealthy in various ways, and it was certainly dirty and smoky. But Tacoma Park was considered to be clean and safe and nice, and so a lot of rich people moved out because they could afford to take a train in every morning or when they needed to. And so we saw people in general moving from rural areas to cities or suburbs, and especially cities for the working class people. So what we saw, and the Davis article talked about this, except Davis is talking about percentage of population, and if you look at this graph, I just have population. But it can be considered the same trend. So it's the same sort of mechanism at work whereby people came from the rural areas to the cities. And so I could plot, and I'll do this later, many different sorts of cities. So New York follows the same trend. A lot of other cities do as well. But let's concentrate on Baltimore and Washington, D.C. What we see here is this nearly exponential growth of population starting in about 1850 and going until, where I have put a box about 1950, so the 1940s, 1950. And so what we, this is nearly identical to the, what do you call an S-curve, so which is a normal distribution laid out in a different way, if you're familiar with statistics at all. And this is a very common growth function. So growth often happens in this sort of way. And so what Davis thought would happen was that it would sort of top out at a certain rate, and you kind of see this happening at the top of this, near the 1940. You can kind of hint that maybe it'll be topping out, and then to stabilize at a certain level. So he thought it would stabilize at a certain level of urban living, of people living in cities, at a very high percentage. And so, that's what we might expect would happen. However, after 1950, something happened. So something happened to limit this increase in the number of people living in cities. So we see in both Baltimore and Washington D.C., and it's striking that it happens nearly identically for both cities. Near the exact same points. So these are census times, so the increment is in 10 years. We see this decline. So between the 1950 census and the 1960 census, we see a decrease in population, whereas before there had been dramatic increases in population. And this is what we'll need to explain. And it seems like the most natural explanation is, as I have in the title, that cars became popular. So people came back from the war. So this is where we're talking about post-World War II U.S. People came back from the war. A lot of middle-class people were able to buy houses. They were able to buy cars. And, the government accommodated this. So we had massive expansion of suburban communities. So let's look closely at why this happened. So why, in the previous slide, we saw the decrease in populations once cities got to about 1950, why their populations actually decreased, which is very odd. I mean, it's a huge reversal because they had been increasing exponentially before. So what someone might think, and what I want to do is with every one of these explanations, there's a certain sort of normative thing you can say, meaning there's a certain thing you can say about whether this was good or not, or whether this, if this is the reason people move to the suburbs, whether we should think it was a good reason, or a good cause of it. So the first one that's kind of natural, and I think might be the dominant one, depending on who you talk about, is that people just prefer the suburbs over the industrial cities. So as you read in Mumford, cities had improved by 1940, but not by very much. They were still very dirty, polluted places, crowded. Modern technology and modern sort of ways of protecting the environment had not come into use yet. And so the industrial cities were unpleasant places, and people just like having their own house, their own yard. They liked the suburbs. They liked what the suburbs offered, and they liked being able to move around whenever they wanted in their own car. And these cars were cheap, relatively. And so what you saw in this time period was finally people were able to get what they had wanted. They wanted to be able to live in in an area that's suburban, and yet be able to have a job, which they couldn't do before, because if you lived in a suburban or rural area, you wouldn't be able to have the job in the city. For the first time, they're able to have that job too, to commute in their car and yet live in the suburbs, and they did so. So you might think this is just a natural expression of their autonomy. People have preferences for things, and they're making a clear choice. They want to live in the suburbs. And that's going to be difficult to argue against. And, people have, as we'll see. But this seems to be, just a dominant trend. As the trend from moving from rural areas to the industrial city was very dominant, people seem to be making a choice to do so. This will also seem like a similar dominant trend. However, it's more complex. So people who sort of are defending urban environments and think that the move to the suburbs was generally a bad thing will say that a major cause of it was governmental policy. So this was not the preferences of people, but this was just government doing something that they thought was best for people, and this affecting their choices. And so when we talk about technocrats versus versus democracy, so technocrat is just some elite person who knows the technical aspects of things. So they might be the city designer. They might be the person who is pushing a certain vision of life that might be suburban over urban, making decisions. And so what the person who thinks government policy affected, um, the movement towards the suburbs will say is that we put so much trust in the technocrats to make choices for us in the 1950s, and this is the case. We had, I mean, there was a lot of power in the hands of individual bureaucrats, appointed bureaucrats, to make lots of choices about how we design cities. This is true, and this may have had a huge effect on what we actually did. So one thing that we did was we funded federal highways. We decided to build a federal highway system in the 40s and 50s and into the 60s. That was just a gigantic expenditure. This was huge. This project was probably the largest project we have ever undertaken, the most expensive national project ever. And what it did was connect all the cities in the country, pretty much, with national highways, with beautiful national highways that you could drive quickly on, were safe, smooth, just wonderful things to drive on. And we did this through a dedicated gas tax. So we decided that there's going to be this tax on gasoline, and that is going to go directly to this federal highway system. And if anyone who knows anything about federal budgeting knows, being able to make a given tax go directly to some expenditure is an amazing thing for that expenditure. It all of a sudden does not become a pawn in budgeting processes, basically, because it has to go directly to it. Today, our gas taxes are not paying for all of the highways we need because gas consumption has gone down. But in the beginning, it was. And this is just federal highways. So states were also doing a similar thing, for their highways, and roads are becoming much nicer. And so, basically the federal government decided, and state governments and local governments decided to make driving better and easier. So another thing was that, it was pretty much decided that in metropolitan areas, we should focus on getting people in the suburbs to the city and getting them between, different suburbs. And that was what much of our design was going towards. So we adopted in the 50s and 60s a car-oriented design scheme for urban development. And so we did certain zoning rules were meant to keep uses apart. So we had factories in one area, we had residential areas in one area, and commercial areas in another. And so you needed a car basically to get from your house to the store to work. We separated uses. What this was meant to do was get rid of this problem where a factory would make a residential area disgusting and cause pollution in a residential area, which is very unpleasant. And so this is what we wanted to do, and we did that. And so there were some good reasons for it, but this had the effect of forcing people to get cars. So another thing that we did, U.S. did, was subsidized home ownership, essentially. So what this was done in the 30s and 40s, was for the first time, when we came out with income taxes, we allowed people to basically take the interest they paid on home loans out of their taxes, so it was deductible. So what this essentially did was it lowered the taxes on homeowners versus renters. And so it subsidized home ownership. And so you might think, so the thinking behind this was that we want people to own their own homes wherever they are. But because it makes things more stable and such, makes communities more stable when people own their own homes. So you might think that's right. What it in fact did was, perhaps, I'm not sure how much this was a cause of what happened from people going from the city to the suburbs, but where could middle class people buy homes? Well, it's in the suburbs. they couldn't afford homes in the city center. They could only afford to rent. So this, it both allowed people to afford homes that they might not be able to afford in the suburbs, and also gave them incentive not to keep renting, to buy their home. And so in the 40s and 50s, you had home ownership explode in the, single home ownership explode in the U.S., which had not been the case before. Many more people had rented. So, okay, so those are the governmental policies that you might think caused partially people to move to the suburbs. So finally, you might have heard about this. So there's so a lot of people who think that we were tricked to move to the suburbs in the 40s will put these sort of corporate plots against us, in the sort of category of causes of this. So, and these are real. So actually, corporations did plot to try to make us buy cars. And, the sort of famous case was the GM, Firestone, Standard Oil, and others' monopoly of streetcar lines. So what ended up happening was, and this was in the 30s and 40s, was that these companies, which had interests in people buying cars, they wanted people to buy cars, and so they started buying up streetcar lines, which had been running in many cities, and one of them they bought up was in Baltimore, and then making them convert to buses. And so the thinking is that buses are inferior to streetcars. Streetcars are actually kind of nice to ride on. And so if we make these cities use buses in their transit system. So, also remember that most transit systems at this time were private. So now it's common for public transit to be a public entity. Back in, for most of history, these public transit systems were not public. They're private entities which, they were like utilities, that had a certain service and they charged a certain amount for it. And people decided to ride or not, and they charged fees. And so what GM, Firestone, and Standard Oil and others did was they did this together. They bought up these streetcar lines, converted them to buses, and what ended up happening after this was transit systems went bankrupt all over the country, essentially. So a lot of people thought that this, monopolizing of these transit systems, in a sense, brought public transit down, and what did people have a choice to do after that? Well, they could buy cars and move to the suburbs. So, this is not just a rumor. This actually did happen, and these companies were convicted of this, but they only had a small fine associated with it. So, this did actually happen. But other transit systems were going broke too at this time. So the DC transit system also had streetcar lines, but it was just continually going broke, and eventually they changed the buses because they were cheaper. And so it is true that corporations did collude to sort of make us buy cars in a sense, but it's unclear how effective that was, or if these transit systems were just doomed because of the of the movement of population. So demographics were changing, and people who had money were leaving the city, and this meant there was less money available for these transit systems because less people were riding them. More had cars, and it's easier to own a car outside the city, so a lot more people moved to the suburbs. So this is certainly not clear. So, but people say, well, if this is the case, we were tricked to the suburbs, just as government policy sort of forced us to the suburbs. They made living in the suburbs a deal we couldn't refuse. And so keep these in mind. I think that the first one of these, that people just naturally move to the suburbs, is perhaps the largest cause, but these certainly had effects. And when we're thinking about, later what, governments should be doing as far as policy and who should be deciding, these are the sort of things we should keep in mind. Is it right for a government to fund the federal, a huge highway system when other people might not be using it? Or, should governments be molding, our lives in this way, be subsidizing certain modes of living and punishing others? Is that the proper role of government? It's not clear, and that's a decision we're going to have to make later. So, as we were saying, cities were declining up until, from the 1950s until, the 1970s. And then things got much worse. So, and this is sort of indicated in this graph, and you can see this in many other cities as well. So what happened in the late 1960s? Well,